We are going to get this party started.
Right, as somebody asked what the pictures, that is actually the poster from the Dodger Stadium concert. That's what's in the background in case somebody had asked that. So,
Wow, that is awesome. Are you at home or are you at your office?
I'm at home now.
Well, I want to ask you now, I'm going to introduce you formally in just a minute. And then I put you on the spot, Bruce, and I'm going to ask you to tell us your three favorite Beatles songs. So during the introduction, we'll mull it over. But for those of you who don't know who Bruce Spizer is, you must have been living under a rock, because Bruce is one of the world's, if not the world's premier Beatles music experts. He has written 15, is that right, Bruce? 15?
15, yes.
That's amazing. And I'm not talking about these little fly by night, 4 pages, 50 pages books. We're talking 2-volume set books on the Beatles, records on all of the various recording companies, such as the Beatles Swan Song, a 2-volume work called The Beatles on Capitol Records, the Beatles on Apple Records, Beatles for Sale on Parlophone Records. And as you can see, I know all these by heart. And why do I know them all by heart? Because I use them every single day. One of my very favorites, I bet it's one of Bruce's too, The Beatles Are Coming. Great book. If you don't have that in your library, you should have it. He did all of these, and then, because we badgered him to death, he turned his attention to his album series. And he takes each album and explores the history, what's going on when the album is being made. He sets it in context. And then what's on the album, songs, track by track, and how they were recorded, how they were pressed, how they were released, what the reviews were. It's a wonderful album series. And some of you probably participated in the fans' perspective, the Beatles and Sgt. Pepper, a fans' perspective. I bet a lot of you took part in that because we were able to give our memories of that great LP. The Beatles Finally Let It Be, one of my favorite titles, and the book that he'll be discussing tonight, which is a gorgeous book. All of his books come in a sleeve, and then it's a beautiful hardback book. There is a collector's poster inside, and of course, a bookmark. And then you get page after page after page of both black and white and color, many, many gorgeous color pictures in the book. I'll show you right here. And of course, the most accurate information that you can expect on each one of the songs on both Rubber Soul and Revolver. This is the new book, and that's what we'll be talking about tonight. He is a speaker every year at the Fest for Beatles fans, both in Chicago and New York, and he was around when it was also the Fest in Las Vegas, Los Angeles, all over the country. He's also a beloved speaker at, well, that's true, Bruce, and we'll talk about that. Bruce said, but that's not his newest book. So we'll talk about that in just a minute. Thank you. That is true. He also speaks at Abbey Road on the River. He was the featured author at Beatles at the Ridge several years. And he has recently been featured at a brand new New Orleans Beatles festival, which we'll get him to tell us about. He writes every month for Beatle Fan magazine, very respected publication. Busy, busy man. And we thank you, Bruce, for taking time to be with us tonight.
Well, it's great to be here. It's always fun to be on a podcast where the person who's hosting it knows a thing or two about the Beatles and gets a wonderful audience as well. So it's a lot of fun.
Well, all right. We've given you time to think about it. Give us your top 3 Beatles songs.
Well, I always put it in different categories. My favorite mega hit would have to be Hey Jude. Sorry, it's a Paul song. And my favorite album track that would be well known would be In My Life. And then my favorite obscure Beatles song, if there is such a thing, would be Across the Universe. Not the Spectorized version, but just about any other version.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. Okay, so John gets 2 out of 3.
Yeah, and I'll tell you a fun little story. I have a niece who has a 10-year-old son, and when they were in town for Mardi Gras, he let me know that he was a space junkie and Beatles fan like I am. And so I asked him, well, what is your favorite Beatles song? Figuring, Yellow Submarine or something like that. And he looked at me and he said, "In my life, of course."
Of course. Like, is
Yeah.
there any? I love that. Yes, yes, yes. That is great. Well, what we've been doing, Bruce, and for those of you who haven't been a part of this for the last 2 years, since 2020, we have been traveling through 1965. We joined the Beatles at Shea Stadium and we experienced that. We went to Los Angeles to the Hollywood Bowl and we got to see what was going on through the eyes of Ivor Davis, who was the reporter, the foreign correspondent for the Daily Express. Then we went down to San Diego and Ivor was there as well. And so he joined us on the program. But Kathleen Kaiser, who was the president of the Beatles fan club, joined us. And they talked about that episode in which the Beatles leave San Diego. They are headed back to LA where they're staying and the bus breaks down. And the fans are in hot pursuit. So this is a dangerous situation. And fortunately, they were able to stay in the bus secure until the limousine got there. But they had to transfer from the bus to the limousine. It was not a good situation. We went to Houston, where the Beatles truly were in peril because the fans broke through the police cordon, ran onto the runway as the plane was landing with those slicing rotors turning. And the pilot was able to turn the plane and shut the engine off so that nobody was injured. But now this is a hot jet. This is an Electra 2. They climb up onto the wings. They fill the wings of the plane and they're smoking cigarettes. And the Beatles are freaking out because they think they're going to blow up. They finally bring a high lift and get them off through one of the doors. And Brian almost falls off the lift. In fact, he would have fallen had Mal not caught him. It was a whole scary situation. We visited there. And then finally, the boys have now gone back to England. Most books will tell you that they had 6 weeks to write 10 songs because they already have weight in the can. So that's done. George is going to write his 2 songs. So that's of the 14, those 3 are taken care of. And they also have a bit of Michelle, which Paul is going to call back up and refresh and make into a full-fledged song. But they have 10 songs they really have to write. And the first week, they do not write songs. John, Cynthia, and Julia go down to Harbor's Edge to visit Mimi, and they're down there a few days just walking on the shore, digging in the sand and unwinding. When he gets back home, Paul, George, and John all get into a car and go home to Liverpool. Paul, of course, visits with Jim Mack, George with his family, and John goes to spend time with his sisters, who he hasn't seen in quite a while. So they're up there for about 3 or 4 days and they come home. And you say, well, why didn't Ringo go see his parents? Well, because Maureen is very pregnant and she's about to have a baby, Zach, any day, and he's afraid to leave her. So that week is gone. So they've got 5 weeks now to write these songs. And much later, Paul says it was very impossible to write 10 songs in only 5 weeks. And in fact, they don't have it done by the time that they come into studio for the first time on the 12th of October. We're getting ready to go back to the 12th of October, and we're going to look at what happened when they do go into studio. But I want to apologize ahead of time because for those of you who don't ordinarily come to this Focal Points gathering, we have had the best professional narrator and voice expert reading these scripts for us for the last 2 times, Scott R. McKinley, who did the brilliant voice work for She Loves You, Volume 3 in the John Lennon series. He did 183 different voices, all the Beatles, Brian, Mal, Neil, Tony Barrow, Sid Bernstein, Ed Sullivan, on and on and on. He's blushing off camera. And he was so good. But now you're going to hear the Louisiana version of October 12th, 1965. I'll do my best, but I in no way can be Scott McKinley. You'll have to hear him. Check out the audiobook. It's for sale for only $12 on some of the audiobook venues, and it's a 33-hour book. Just saying, you can't get entertainment that cheap. So it's going to take Rand, who did our wonderful PowerPoint. His PowerPoints are always great, but he's knew Bruce is going to be here tonight, and Bruce always has great PowerPoints. So, man, he's even topped his best. So, all right, give us a second, and we're going to set it up. Just 1 sec. We're going to be taking you back.
Let me take you back.
That's right. He's opening it. We're almost there. Okay. And hopefully our music will play and everything will go smoothly according to plan. There you go.
No, it's not coming up. No, I mean this.
All right, hang on. While we're doing that, I will, our next focal points for everybody that would like to join us will be, there we go, on the 12th of December. It's going to be a big holiday party with Joe Johnson. What we're going to do is play each one of the Beatles' individual Christmas songs, like Ding Dong, Ding Dong, and Simply Having a Wonderful Christmas Time. And then Joe is going to talk about each one of the songs. And then after that, we're going to play one, maybe two of the Beatles' Christmas records for the fans and talk a little bit about that, the history of that. But mainly, we're going to be giving away a ton of prezzies. We're going to have all kinds of Christmas and Hanukkah and holiday gifts to give away. And we're going to put all of you up on camera. So it's not going to be, it's going to be all of us. We can talk to one another. We can share things. And so I hope that you will enjoy that. Okay, we're ready. Here we go. All right, Bruce, can you still see us?
I can see you and I can see the screen.
Okay, we are ready to rock and roll. I'm going to put this up so you don't have to look at me. And here we go. An Evening in Norwegian Wood with the one and only Bruce Spizer. Tuesday, 12 October, 1965. EMI Studios, Studio 2, 3 Abbey Road, St. John's Wood, London. 7 p.m. With Run for Your Life now in the can, George Martin suggested a dinner break, but as usual, the Beatles preferred Working On. And for John, who was somewhat ill at ease about the swift turnaround rocker that he'd recorded this afternoon, Run for Your Life, showcasing his next offering was important. It validated him. Somewhere in his Quarry Bank days, a professor had suggested that a song is a crippled poem that leans upon music for its support. That too-pat assessment always galled John, and with This Bird Has Flown, he'd set out to prove that theory untrue. This Bird Had Flown had waited for a long time for its debut. Over a year ago, someone had snapped a photo of John's original lyrics on the 1964 North American tour. Since then, the song had taken many a twist and turn, including an impromptu audition for George Martin during the Lennon's Swiss holiday with George and his lady friend Judy late last January. Clowning for his friends in St. Moritz's exotic palace hotel in a vain attempt to best John at farcical mimicry, Martin had fallen in their hotel suite and broken his foot. The next day, the ailing producer was left behind in hotel, whilst Judy, Cynthia, and John tobogganed, laughed, and tried to ski. But that evening, John had attempted to cheer George with a strange new ballad he was perfecting. Whilst Judy and Finn sipped mulled wine and chatted in the firelight, John had softly strummed his guitar, singing dry lyrics about what could only be construed as a clandestine affair. Instead of cheering Martin, the song had rather jarred him. Its artful narrative was confessional and painfully clear. John was admitting an infidelity. Martin's eyes kept sliding uneasily over Cynthia. He shifted nervously, frowning, biting his bottom lip. That's a very bitter little story, he muttered to John, raising the song away. A slightly sick lyric, Martin had thought. And he was tremendously relieved when John had moved on to another new number, a rocker called Ticket to Ride. In spite of Martin's rebuff, John liked the quirky new ballad. He thought it one of his best in quite a long while. In only 26 lines, he'd created an intriguing tale, people with striking characters and topped with a shocking conclusion. Moreover, he managed to be a bit naughty to boot. John enjoyed this edgy departure from bow at the waist Beatle John. All in all, he was pleased with the work. So pleased, in fact, that in late spring, when George Harrison had started messing about with the sitar, John had premiered the poetic number for him one evening in Kenwood. That evening, George had dragged his new India craft sitar along and was painstakingly demonstrating what he had learned thus far. Yeah, great. John had nodded enthusiastically. Could you play this piece then? And he grabbed up his 12-string and strummed This Bird Has Flown. John's eyes were bright, his eyebrows arched. Watching John's enthusiasm, George chuckled, yeah, okay, I might do. I mean, I'm only just learning, you know, but I could give it a go, as it were. John sang a wisp of a suggested sitar line for George, notes weaving an exotic backdrop for the mysterious number, and then re-singing the line slowly. George had committed the line to memory and had agreed to suss it out. Tonight, a full 5 months later, John was eager to hear the results. The others settled in, adjusted straps, mics, and instruments. George Martin strolled through with hellos, and Norman Smith, engineer, checked levels, made modifications. Quietly, Alf and Mal settled in for a round of cards, while John ran through the song in his head. When everyone nodded ready, they plunged into rehearsal, and then another, and yet another. But no matter what John tried, the sound wasn't right. It's not coming out like I said, he cried, frustrated. Well, Martin cajoled from above over the one MC. Just do it how you want to do it. Well, I want to do it like this, John snapped. And he jumped in, strumming his famous hootenanny very loudly and singing at the same time. Typically, Lennon's vocals were recorded separately, but tonight, this combination worked. Martin cut his eyes at Norman Smith, and they nodded once. When John reached the final note, he paused for a moment, then swiveled to George. Do you think you can play that piece I wrote? You know, the dee diddly dee bit. Yeah, well, George confessed, I'm not 100% sure, but I said I'd give it a try, so yeah, I'll give it a try. Over the next few hours, try they did. In 4 hours of work, bit by artistic bit, the Beatles completed what was known as Take One. John singing over his 12-string on track 1, Paul manning the bass, and Ringo playing just the bass drum and the cymbal on track 2. Then a re-recorded Lennon vocal with Paul's harmony and George's sitar comprised track 3. And finally, on track 4, John added a second lead vocal. George recorded a second sitar line, and Ringo added finger cymbals and maracas. Layer upon meticulous layer, they fashioned This Bird Has Flown. Repeatedly throughout the process, both John and George grumbled about how difficult the song was to play, while up in the booth, Norman Smith was grousing as well. This song, the engineer said, it's a challenge. He shook his head at Martin and second engineer, Ken Scott. Lots of nasty peaks, very complex waveform. My meter goes right over into the red, into distortion, without us getting audible value for the money. I could use a limiter, but that would mean a reduction of sonorous quality. Yes, I know, Martin nodded emphatically. I worked with a sitar back in '59 on a Peter Sellers rendition of Wouldn't It Be Lovely? And I remember just how problematic it is to record. But listen, Norman, I wouldn't fret over much. To be honest, I'm not convinced John's entirely happy with what we have anyway. Martin slid his eyes to the studio below. John doesn't like much. It isn't just his voice. Everything in his mind is much better than reality. He's somewhat disappointed with the results of what we can do. Right, Smith nodded. And he's not happy now, is he? Well, if I were to speculate, Martin held up a palm, I'd say we'll see this song again. And the producer was absolutely right. At close of evening, although John's raw and slightly scouse vocal was superb, and the sitar's call and response pattern was quite unique, John was unsatisfied. Let's say we call it a night, Martin suggested hopefully. It had just gone 11 p.m., and counting the work that they'd done on Run for Your Life, they had been at it since 2 that afternoon. Let's put a bit of distance between us and the recording. Let it marinate, as it were. Yeah, right, John agreed. Think it over. He still had a long 27-mile commute out to the wilds of Weybridge, and he was weary. They all were. But as the boys packed their equipment in Studio 2's dimming lights, they knew that ultimately John would scrap take one and begin afresh. John had a vision for this exotic song. He knew precisely how he wanted it to sound. And this was not it. Not at all. We're going to listen now to take one. That was a little snippet from Shades of Life Part 2, which will be out in October of 2024, working away. And now we're going to let you hear the song. But for those of you who are listening to this in archives, you're not going to be able to hear the music. We'll have to remove it to put it in archives. But you can ask your Alexa device to play it for you. And if you will do it when I say go, you'll be able to watch it along with the video. 1, 2, 3, go. And that is take one and the story of take one. You can go ahead, Rand, and stop share from Shades of Life Part 2. And for those of you who don't know anything about the John Lennon series, none of the words that the people spoke in this chapter are fictional or made up. They are all direct quotes from exactly what was said on the EMI tapes. So this is all what you're getting is what happened. We are now going to turn it over to Bruce. And Bruce, my first question is, tell us about the differences between what we just heard, This Bird Has Flown, take one, and what becomes the song that we all originally heard when we listened to Rubber Soul, Norwegian Wood, parentheses, This Bird Has Flown.
Right. Well, the thing, and we heard this first on Anthology, and it was quite a remarkable recording to hear. First of all, you have the acoustic guitar that doesn't have a clean sound like most acoustic guitars do. And I suspect, maybe it was because they were concerned about making sure John's voice was recorded properly and the microphone on the acoustic guitar. And also, I'm not convinced all 12 of those strings are in tune. So, but anyway, it's kind of, and John's just doing basic strumming, nothing intricate on it. George, you can tell, is just learning how to play sitar, and he's got a ways to go. Paul's bass is very rudimentary, and Ringo doing some, mild percussion, just basically on the bass drum. So, it's not a bad recording. I think if it had been released that way, we would have been blown away by it. But I can certainly understand why John wanted another go at it. So when they did another go at it, John wanted to do something more than just strumming the guitar, and he came up with a more intricate acoustic guitar part, which he played on his Gibson Jumbo, or actually George's. Might have still been George's Gibson Jumbo. I know John's had been stolen. I'm not sure when they got all that straight again. But anyway, he's playing it on on a six-string acoustic guitar and having a little bit of trouble. If you hear some of the earlier takes on it, he has difficulty with it, and he plays a little bit and screws it up, and he goes, nope, wrong. And then, he finally plays the whole song all the way through and gets the acoustic guitar right. And at the end, proudly tells George Martin, I showed you, which I think is, typical John. And then you also notice George's sitar playing is much improved on it. I think George is strumming along on a 12 string, and then he overdubs the sitar part. Paul's bass is better. The percussion's works out a little bit better with tambourine, which is a little bit more straightforward and fits in. So it's a much cleaner recording. It's very clean,
Yeah.
And I think it just works better. There's some fun things in the first one. I mean, at the end of the song where George is doing some kind of improvisation on sitar, and I don't know if that was really intended to be the end of the song or whether, the song's over, I'm just going to mess around. And it certainly could have been, faded out before then. But, I'm really glad that we had the opportunity to hear that, because what it does, it shows, the brilliance of the Beatles in the studio. They come up with an idea that would have been revolutionary had it been released that way. Yet they realize it can be and should be improved, and they improve it significantly when they record it later.
Yeah, and when George Martin says John isn't happy with many things, it's all what's in his mind is always better than reality. That's a direct quote from George Martin, and thank goodness, because he never settles. He always wants it. He wants what's up here to be translated, and sometimes you can't do that, but he keeps trying. Okay, Bruce, you said something. You and I did a fest blog together over a year ago on Norwegian Wood, and you said something in there that blew me away. And no one has ever said this before, and I think this should be in itself a book if you ever have time to do this. But what used to be said was that Revolver was a revolutionary LP. That's when everything changed. The Beatles completely changed. They evolved. They were mature. Their songs were about more complex themes, yada, yada. Then people began to realize that the change had taken place much sooner, that by the time that you get to Rubber Soul, they're not dealing with Moon, Spoon, Croon, June. They are dealing with very complex love situations. They are dealing with relationships that are not always happy and easy and zippy and peppy and bursting. We love Janet Davis. We both love Odd Couple, and that's an Odd Couple allusion. They are dealing with very serious subjects. But you said it really isn't Rubber Soul where the transformation began. The transformation started with Help. Tell us about that.
Yeah, they start with the 4-track recorder, and it's okay, well, we can do more interesting things. And you hear it in A Hard Day's Night, particularly with percussion. So on this title song, A Hard Day's Night, which is one of the latter tracks recorded for the album, you've got Norman Smith on bongos, you've got Ringo hitting cowbell strategically, and, in other songs like Things We Said Today, strategic use of the tambourine, and various other little things. And so they're getting the idea of, gee, we can overdub different things and have fun with it. By the time, Beatles for Sale, you get some pretty nifty percussion. And then with Help, it's not just percussion type instruments, but other things. So for Yesterday, George Martin has the idea, we'll put a string quartet on. And, and ideas like that. So by the time they've gotten to Help, they really have mastered what you can do with the 4-track recorder and with the overdubs. And so by the time Rubber Soul rolls around, it's like, well, what if we start using some new instruments, and bring in the sitar? I mean, we used on Help, we used like a pianette, and, we use these other keyboard type things, and those were kind of cool. So I think that's what makes it so interesting. And in Rubber Soul, I think it's the first album, though, where the Beatles songwriting just takes a tremendous leap. And as you had talked about before, all the more remarkable for the short period of time they had to write those songs.
Right. I mean, it's incredible.
Yeah.
It's utterly incredible. And they don't, that first day, they really only have Run for Your Life ready. And the concept of This Bird Has Flown, they record one more day, then they have to take a songwriting day because they don't have anything else, really totally prepared. And this is the pattern throughout October and November. But the fact that they pull this album together from the 12th of October to the 12th of November in 30 days, I mean, it's no marathon feat like the Please Please Me LP, but it's much more complex music. So,
and let us not forget that they also recorded these 2 so-so songs for a single. We Can Work It Out and Day Trippers. So, I mean, when you consider that, and what I always like telling people is they did 16 songs in this time frame. And when you look at the Beatles Red collection, half of those songs are on that album. By far the most of any album session to have 8 out of, one half out of 16. Just incredible. To show you the songwriting quality that they've evolved to.
And one of the things that you pointed out that nobody else mentioned was the fact that the lyrics for this were photographed, as I said in the chapter, on the 1964, not 5, the 1964 North American tour. So John had this song for, a year and a half or more. And then he premieres it at the end of January 1965 for George Martin. So the claims that John didn't have the song written and the song was written by others does not hold water, because the song had been written for a year and a half. And you point that out in both the new book. I know, not the newest one, but your new book, The Beatles Rubber Soul to Revolver. You also are the one that gave us the quote about Norman Smith having a difficult time recording it because of the jumps and the going into the red zone, and he could use the limiter, but that's going to reduce the sonorous quality. So much of that came from this great book. So I have one more question for you, then I'm going to turn it to the audience and let them ask questions. So that is, if you look at the 2 versions of Rubber Soul, you have this beautiful Parlophone with the orange-red Rubber Soul. Get George in there for...
Almost matches your hair tonight.
There we go. Yes, it does. And he says tonight because he knows I change my hair color like every 3 months.
Changes from day to day.
That's true. That's true. Or this beat-up version, which is my version with my name written on it. I think my dad knew I was going to a party. And it's... this is the capital version. you pointed out that This Bird Has Flown, Norwegian Wood, is the second song on both versions, and yet it works with two different intro songs. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the Parlophone album, and you've got Drive My Car, which is a bit of a musically very, very different song than Norwegian Wood, more of a hard rock type song. But the lyrics to Drive My Car are very sexual. Drive my car being a euphemism for sex, and hope I didn't shock anybody by telling them that. And so you have the double entendres and the whole thing about that. And so thematically, you've got this person who's, she's found the driver, and that just starts. You've got some clever lyrics that John and Paul came up with for that. And then you go into John's clandestine affair for Norwegian Wood. It sounds musically different, but lyrically, there's enough similarities to where they work well together. And then, you go on the Capitol version, and they pick a song that I have always said was lost on side 2 of the Parlophone Help album, I've Just Seen a Face.
Right.
And here it opens an album, and Paul's acoustic guitar just grabs you, and you are just pulled into that song. And when the song ends, now you've pulled into John Lennon's intricate guitar playing on Norwegian Wood. So in that regard, musically, those two songs flow really well together. And that's why people will say, well, gee, this Capitol album makes this great folk rock album. And obviously it was not what the Beatles intended, but it's a great album. And I get asked this question all the time, well, Bruce, which album's better, the British Rubber Soul or the American Rubber Soul? And what I always say is it's not really a fair question. It'd be like asking somebody to compare a great red wine to a great white wine.
Right.
They have their own subtleties and differences. And, the British version, the Rubber Soul, that's that red wine, that hard rock type at times, whereas the Capitol one is more of the white wine of the two albums. But I think they're both brilliant in their own ways.
And when you start in the Capitol version, I've Just Seen the Face, it's still happy, and it's light, and it's airy, and it's full of being enamored with the new love. And then you're hit with Norwegian Wood.
That love affair didn't last too long, did it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a real contrast. So maybe Capitol is easing us into the new Beatles.
I think Capitol had 2 leftover tracks, so they needed to use them. It's that simple,
Let's get real.
We got to do something with It's Only Love and I've Just Seen a Face. And out of the two of them, I've Just Seen a Face grabs you. So we're going to open our album with that. And It's Only Love. We'll start side 2 with the album. So
yes, I love that.
I'm sure that's all there was to it.
We have a question from Leslie. I believe it's Leslie Healy, because I can't see the last name. But it says, how much of the Beatles' creativity do you think comes from a little help from my friends, i.e. marijuana or LSD?
Well, certainly it influenced them, but I think the Beatles' songwriting would have been brilliant without it. I think it certainly changed it. And I think they were more likely to experiment with things. They're experimenting with drugs. They're experimenting with different musical sounds, different lyrical themes. So I think it did have a positive effect. But as Paul was apt to say, he wouldn't tell people, well, this is what I'm doing, but I'm not saying you should do it. So,
right.
I wouldn't want people to think that if they start smoking dope and dropping acid, that they could write like John or Paul.
Right. And also remember, guys, that George Martin said that he always anticipated that there would be a day when the Beatles would come into the studio with a song that wasn't great or that wasn't completely different from all the others. And his quote is, but they never did. Every song was a jewel. And that was true for all the LPs up to Rubber Soul. They were all still jewels. So their creativity prior to marijuana was also brilliant. Okay, Rallis Wiesenthal, let me go back up. Just skipped. Rallis says, Rand, I better let you do that. To Rallis's question. Oh, we went too far up. Okay, keep going. Next one.
one right
Bruce, do you?
That's Patrick's.
Okay, I'll get Patrick next.
Okay.
Bruce, do you wish? Skipping.
There we go.
Okay. Do you wish that John had kept the lyric, "So I lit her fire," rather than "I lit a fire"?
Well, that was ahead of the Doors, baby. Let me light my fire. So I think that it was more ambiguous. I lit her fire would be more of a sexual thing, whereas I lit a fire makes it okay. Well, did he light the fireplace to stay warm when she left it for the day? Or as Paul said, did he burn the frickin' house down?
That's right.
And so I think having it the way it was ambiguous. And I think that I know Paul liked that ambiguity, although Paul claimed it wasn't ambiguous at all. I think in John's case, John liked those double entendres and probably wrote it to be, well, you can interpret it anyway, but it's really cool because she could have burned the house down.
Yeah, exactly. You got one?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. This one is, have you ever noticed that the song "I Wonder" by the Gamps on one of the Nuggets collections is a total ripoff of "In My Life"?
Yeah, I've heard similarities to that. I wouldn't dispute that. And,
Yeah.
and a lot of things where, when you speak about Nuggets, and I don't think the song was on Nuggets, but it's a true nugget. But Lies by the Knickerbockers, to me, is the greatest
Yes.
John Lennon song John never recorded.
Exactly. All right. This one said, Bruce, would you have liked to hear more sitar? Or do you think that it only works on certain songs? That's from Ed Hartnett.
That's a good question. I think on Rubber Soul, I'm trying to think where else you could have used sitar, and I don't think it really would have worked elsewhere. So I think, and also George's playing was very rudimentary at the time. Now you get a lot more sitar on Revolver, but by then George has gotten to the point where he can do something like Love You Too, which I know many people for years and years speculated that that wasn't George on sitar because it was too good to be George, when in fact we know from the Revolver box set, it clearly is George on sitar. So I think it probably best it was used sparingly on Rubber Soul.
And what you pointed this out a few minutes ago, it's much better when they record Norwegian Wood, This Bird Has Flown, and that is 9 days later.
Yeah, George was a quick study.
Really, that's impressive. That's very, very impressive. Hey, Steve, so good to have you here. Amy Andrews, I think, says, what is the earliest date that John started writing Norwegian Wood? So we have a copy of it by the 1964 North American tour, so it has to be before that, right, Bruce?
Yeah, it's something he could have done right on tour. So
yeah,
look, when they were on tour, they took the opportunity to write songs when they were in France in '64, and in the U.S. in Miami and New York. They were writing the songs for the Hard Day's Night at that time.
Right.
So they certainly took the opportunity, with their so-called downtime was spent writing songs.
Yes, absolutely. But it is absolutely not true that it was
Q&A and the
chat. Okay, well, we're going to go down the Q&A thing.
Okay,
so, yeah, we're because we did a lot of those.
Okay,
so now
well,
we're moving.
Fine. I just want to let you know.
Yeah, thank you.
Let people know that.
Yeah, they're coming in both places. You're popular, Bruce. You're being bombarded with questions. Ken Saul says, Bruce, can you speak about how many people consider Rubber Soul an early folk rock album?
Probably everybody in America. Now, seriously, if you were in the UK, you didn't consider it a folk rock album at all. It had all these other sounds on it and rock and roll. But for Americans, I think it really was considered an early folk rock album. Clearly, by then, they had been influenced by Bob Dylan. They had been influenced by the Byrds, who were influenced by the 12-string Rickenbacker on A Hard Day's Night. Obviously, the Beatles didn't consciously say we're going to make a folk rock album any more than I think Dave Dexter at Capitol said we're going to create a Beatles folk rock album. I think it just worked out that way. I think the reason that it worked out that way, like I said earlier, was Capitol had 2 songs left over from the Help sessions that were recorded toward the end that sounded like the stuff on Rubber Soul anyway, so why not use them on Rubber Soul?
Right, right. And the Lovin' Spoonful had already made a gigantic splash.
Yeah.
The Beatles, when they were in LA in 1965, just a few weeks before they make this, have gone to the Byrds studio and hung out with them during 2 different recording sessions. Now, the first time John doesn't go, it's George goes and Paul shows up later. And then the second time they all go. So they're inundated with this folk sound that they've just heard when they've been in America. So Tony DeMeo says, do you know who had the idea for the fuzzbox guitar on Think for Yourself?
I honestly don't. I know John had earlier experimented, wanted that type of distorted sound. And so, it wouldn't surprise me, if John was trying to push toward it, but I honestly don't know on that particular track who had come up with the idea.
Right. And I just did a lot of reading on that, and I did not see anything. George Martin was asked if it turned out to be sort of a mistake or if it was done intentionally. And he said, no, it was done intentionally. It wasn't a mistake, but he did not say whose idea it was. So Bruce Bernstein says, what accounts for the multiple anomalies between various stereo versions versus various mono versions that go beyond the mixes, where sections of different takes are used?
Well, I think, first of all, I'm not quite sure what in particular directing it to. I mean, certainly mono and stereo, if you're going back to Please, Please Me, part of the reason that I think you have a different situation, I think some of the different takes for Please, Please Me, that tape was lost. And then when they go to do the stereo album version of it, they have less takes to work with. And that's why they have to use a verse with John's flub lyrics. So some of it is that. And then also, keep in mind that always the mono mix was the main thing they were working on. They wanted to get it right. And A Hard Day's Night, I'll Cry Instead is different in the U.S. mono because that was going to be supposedly used in the film. So they had to make an edit to make it longer. So, you had different things like that. Some people say, well, the Capitol mixes, and of course that is a misnomer. Capitol did not mix these songs at all.
Right.
Capitol added reverb or, mastered them. It's a mastering difference, but not a mixing difference. So when somebody says, well, this particular Capitol mix, no, it's this Capitol mastering, and that accounts for the differences of a song. Now, sometimes George Martin would try to outthink Capitol. Okay, Capitol likes reverb, so for I Feel Fine, I'm going to add a little reverb for this mix. And then Capitol would get the mix, and of course Capitol would add reverb to it on top of it. So it would really sound drastically different from the UK.
Right, right. I'm going to ask Dara's question, and then Patrick, we're going to come back to yours next, because what she asked then feeds into what you're asking. So Dara said, and I answered this for her earlier, and I can either tell you my answer or I can wait till after you give yours. Bruce, who do you think is the girl in the song? My dad, Wayne Roberts, who loves this song, wants your opinion on this. He got Jude's earlier. So do you want me to tell you what I said, or do you want me to tell you later?
I'll give I don't focus on the Beatles' sex lives, even though I did a book called The Beatles Are Coming. But anyway, I had always thought it could be somebody, maybe as pedestrian as Maureen Cleave, but I really don't know if that's the case here, because that's a little bit further along the line. So I know you would have researched it more than me, Jude, and I joke about it because one of the very first Beatle fests I was out, there was a sign in the hallway saying, the Beatles records on VJ, Bruce Spizer, and so I started my talk, and about 5 minutes into it, this woman raised her hand and said, did John ever have sex with Maureen Cleave? And then about 10 minutes later, did John ever have sex with, but I've always emphasized the point where obviously the women that were in the Beatles' lives are important as to how it influenced the music, but I don't really go into it beyond that. So anything I did would be pure speculation, whereas I'm sure Jude's answer would be a lot better research than mine.
Well, when John and Cynthia were looking for a place to live in London in December of 63, December of 1963, Bob Freeman, who had photographed them, said to John, there's an open mansionette, which is a 2-story apartment with a stair going up in my building, Emperor's Gate. And it's a real trendy part of London. I think you'd love it. I think you and Cynthia ought to look at it. So they did. And they foolishly accepted that mansionette because it did not have an elevator. It had an outdoor stairway. So every morning, John had to go down 3 flights of stairs with the fans all over those stairs, and they tore him to pieces. He even got a bodyguard, and they tore him and the bodyguard to pieces. And he would come.
So that was like 3-flight rock as opposed to 21-flight rock.
Exactly, and I mean rock too.
Yeah.
It was, and when Cynthia would go out, they wanted to touch Julian and touch her, and can we? She was scared. She was really scared. Well, Bob Freeman and his wife Sunny, a gorgeous Pirelli model. She never went by Sunny Freeman. She went by Sunny Drain, but people call her Sunny Freeman, lived in the floor below. And their apartment was covered in a very trendy, at that time, kind of like IKEA, wood. Sunny was German, but World War II had just ended. And so she called herself Norwegian. And there is no doubt about it that they had an affair because Cynthia talks about it in her book, John, 2005 version in her book, John. And she says that at one point in January, Bob Freeman comes up to their apartment in Emperor's Gate. He's pulling Sunny by the arm. She's crying. He's red in the face. They tell Cynthia to leave the room, and she can hear shouting. And then when they leave, she says, John, what's going on? And he says, don't worry about it. It's none of your business, and goes up to the music room. And she said, I know that they had an affair. Now, on the other hand, Maureen Cleave got furious every time that someone said it was about her. She said, we did not have that kind of relationship. It was professional. John was interested in my brain, not my body. And she refused to give interviews about it. Could have been, who knows? But the evidence seems to weigh more heavily in the Sunny Drain.
And that is why I refer to you for questions like that.
Okay. Howard Cohen says, Bruce, how did they come up with the title Rubber Soul? Was the idea Plastic Soul, what they were calling the Rolling Stones music? Is that right?
Well, Plastic Soul, I think Paul used that at one of the help tracks afterwards. And so, and they wanted something that was a pun. And, Plastic Soul is obviously not a pun, but Rubber Soul would be, in the sense of a shoe would have a rubber sole. And of course, the music, soul music. But, I know one of the reviewers in the UK, I forget who he was, but he talked about it being, perhaps they were trying to tell us that it was soul music with a bounce. But I don't know. I think it was more of the pun idea, Rubber Soul. Then they went ahead with Revolver. Capitol helped them in between with an album called Yesterday and Today. So they had a lot of puns in there.
Yeah, and as Paul said, we did some joke songs on this record. So Drive My Car being one of the joke songs. So Patrick Asada says, aside from Paul's claim, what evidence do we have that it might have been burning her house down? I've heard others arrive at that conclusion, but to me, it was always the fireplace. How far does this ambiguity go back time-wise, or is this a recent explanation? I
mean, I remember hearing fairly early on about, she burned the house down. But, and I was like, nah. My view was, guy lit a fire to keep warm. And, but Paul has insisted from the beginning, this was what it meant. And maybe that's true, but Paul has a tendency sometimes to look back at things and, have different meanings for the lyrics. And his contemporary interpretation, he'll say, well, that's what it always was. And that may or may not be true. I don't know. So it's kind of hard to say. In my mind, I prefer that he lit the fire to keep warm. I'd hate to think that, John was fantasizing about being an arsonist.
Well, and he could have been so mad that, as we all say, okay, just smack that person, or what. He could have been so mad that he thought about it, and that was a potential and possible ending, but not the ending. Wait, I've got one right here. Then Scott says, a true lawyer's answer.
Yeah, I like that, Scott. I figure since this podcast is archived, I don't want to say anything that's going to get me sued by anybody.
Yeah, no joke, really. No, really. Okay, so Jess Hernandez says, not a question really, but just a coincidence. My dad's favorite Beatles album ever is the U.S. Rubber Soul album. He bought it when it came out originally in December 1965. My favorite Beatles album of all time is the UK Rubber Soul, their British version and George Martin's vision. And so there's an interesting thing about that, Jess. I'm going to throw this over to Bruce, is that during the time that the Beatles, well, all through the summer of 1965, and especially during the time that the Beatles were on the 1965 North American tour, George Martin was in contract negotiations with EMI. And he in Lennon Wood, and he really kept, it wasn't asking for a raise in salary. He was asking for a share in the profits that he had brought to the company. Very intricate. There's a whole chapter on it in Maximum Volume, Ken Womack's book, the biography of George Martin. There's a whole chapter. But the bottom line is Lennon Wood refused to come to the table with an equitable offer for George Martin. So George Martin very politely left and formed an independent producers company, AIR. So when he is making Rubber Soul for the Beatles, he is no longer their boss. He is no longer the one telling them what to do. They have employed him to work for them. And for the first time, the tables have turned, and he is functioning as doing more what the Beatles say than him suggesting and being the overawing presence. So, Bruce, is that right, or you want to add to that, or?
I think it's that technically the Beatles were certainly getting more bold about their use of instruments and sounds in the studio, but I still think they were looking up to George Martin as their boss at that time, even though technically they had asked EMI to hire George Martin to produce their album. I still think at that time, he was still boss. I think the wheels didn't fall off for George Martin until the White Album, where, by that time, the Beatles really felt that, we're in charge here. So I think Rubber Soul is a little bit too early for that. It's my thinking.
Yeah. This is one from Fred, and I will say, I totally agree. They did respect what he said, and they followed exactly what he said. But I think there's a shift starting to occur where they, too, are coming into their own. They're making...
Absolutely.
Fred Barnaby, is that right? Or Barnaby? Fred, you'll have to tell us how to say that. Ask, is it true that John hated Run for Your Life?
John has said he's always hated it. So if you take him as his word, he did hate it. I think he kind of might have been bothered by the fact that he copied the opening lines of the song, right out of a, old blues number. So I think that could be part of it. I think John probably looked back at it and said, we needed to write songs for an album, and this is one I just forced up. Now, the ironic thing about it, when I did the book and I did the research on all the different reviews coming out of the UK, several of the UK reviewers thought Run for Your Life was the best song on the album.
Yep.
And I find that startling because to me, it's one of my least favorite songs on the album. I hope that doesn't offend you, Jude.
No.
But I never really liked Run for Your Life that much. I thought it was kind of a mean-spirited type song. And I know John could be that way, but I didn't particularly like the song. Yet in the UK, for some reason, almost all the reviews absolutely love that song. And it's a different era. If Run for Your Life had been released today by some group, I mean, can you imagine the horrors that you would be hearing of? Oh my God, you can't write a song like that.
Yes, but of course it wasn't. And if you look back at the songs of that era, 1964, Joni Summers has a hit with Johnny Get Angry. And she's telling him, what's wrong with you? You never shout at me. You never yell at me. You never get jealous. You never shove me around. You must not love me. Johnny Get Angry.
Then and how about the song that Phil Spector did with, I think it was the Crystals, or it might have been it was the Ronettes, I think. He hit me and it felt like a kiss.
Exactly. Or 1967's gigantic hit by Jimi Hendrix, Hey Joe. Where you going with that gun in your hand? Going to shoot my wife? Caught her messing around with another man? Or Under My Thumb?
Yeah.
She's under my thumb. She's down. It's down to me. So this song was not inappropriate for 1964. 1965. And the reason John hated it, and he says it because people chop it off and he hated it and they don't say the rest of the sentence, is because it was written so quickly. It was written under duress. He didn't have time to polish it. The song wasn't misogynistic. He wasn't apologizing for the lyrics. He was saying, I didn't get to polish the song. I think it harkens back to an earlier time, you know? It's a song that, like, you can't do that.
Yeah, exactly. I was thinking the same thing.
So, all right, Michael Cooper says, do you think the Beatles were serious about recording at Stax? And how do you think it would have influenced or changed their sound?
I think the Beatles initially thought it was a great idea because they loved that bass sound they were hearing on records by Wilson Pickett and people like that. And I think as a practical matter, they realized, coming to the States to record was going to be a problem. But also, it's really good that they seriously approached it. They certainly were. I mean, they looked into it. So it was no idle plan. But what it did was it really shook to the core those very proud Abbey Road engineers and said, okay, well, you want more bass? We'll give you more bass. We'll record the bass differently. And when you listen to the Revolver album, that's the Paperback Writer in Rain. Those are the first recordings where Paul's bass really jumps up a notch. And so I think the threat of going to Stax was a really big deal. If they had gone to Stax, it probably would have sounded different. But I think the mere threat of going to Stax really shook up those Abbey Road engineers, and they did an incredible job with the bass.
There's a quote by Alfred Lord Tennyson, I am a part of all I have met. Imagine the Beatles moving for a month and living in the United States and living right where Stax is and being a part of that whole world. It definitely would have changed.
Yeah, it would have, but I think they felt they really couldn't do that. I think as I understood the plan, they were going to go there and record a single, sort of like maybe what they did in Paris. Yeah, we did Can't Buy Me Love in Paris, so we'll go to the States and record our new single there. So, maybe Paperback Writer in Rain gets recorded at Stax.
Right. Well, I think this is probably Howard Cohen. I can only see Howa. Getting
How
away.
are you doing?
Howa, how are you? Getting away from Rubber Soul. Did you hear the Stowe School concert, and what did you think of it?
Yeah, I did hear it, and I think it's a great thing to have. It was always nice to have a lot of those songs with the BBC recordings and bootlegs, but to hear in concert and hear all their working things, I think it's just incredible. Obviously, I'd like to hear it slightly more cleaned up. I mean, it's, for all things considered, it sounds pretty good, and it shows you that the Beatles really were a good band, particularly when they could hear themselves.
Right.
And I think that the other thing that I tell people is, in a way, it's unfortunate that John and Paul were such prolific songwriters, because we don't have EMI proper recordings of all these great rock and roll songs that we would have had if, say, on an album, okay, well, we need, 6 more rock and roll tunes. So, I really wish they had found a way. Maybe if the Beatles had done a couple of more EPs with original music or something like that, because imagine how frustrating it would be, for somebody in a world where Long Tall Sally was never recorded at EMI Studios. So, I wish they had recorded more of those great rock and roll songs. I mean, their songwriting was great, but, when you take a song like Long Tall Sally and Paul out Little Richard's Little Richard, and all the great things they did with the Larry Williams songs, and, it's just a shame there wasn't more of those great rock and roll songs recorded.
And they loved it.
Oh, yeah.
They loved it, They
absolutely did.
We miss the old songs,
Yeah, I mean, John was asked, after they had released the Long Tall Sally EP and before the Hard Day's Night came out, John was asked, well, what's your favorite Beatles record? He said, oh, Long Tall Sally. And of course, a lot of it, he's promoting the latest record. But the fact of the matter is, even though it was Paul on lead vocals, John really thought that was a great recording.
Yeah. Absolutely. They loved each other's songs. And just by the way, George Harrison said one of his favorite, if not his favorite, John Lennon song was Run for Your Life. So, that's the way. And Patrick, to address your comment about using the Q&A button, I'm using the Q&A button. I'm using both. I use Q&A. I've already answered your first question on Q&A, and then I go over to the chat line, and I come back to Q&A. So here's the second question Patrick had asked is, at the risk of causing you issues, is there any merit that In My Life was more of a joint issue with Paul than we have traditionally understood? Paul has indicated this in recent years. Let me refer you, before Bruce answers, to a blog that Susan Ryan wrote about In My Life on the Fest for Beatles Fans. It's been 7 or 8 months. So you'll have to go to blog and you'll have to scroll back. One of the best blogs we have ever had written for the Fest for Beatles Fans. Susan said, well, I really am not a music expert. Am I out of my depth here? She did research for about 2 months on this and wrote the definitive answer for your question. But Bruce, I'll let you talk about it, and I'll tell you what I remember, and we'll hopefully, Patrick, we can answer it for you.
Yeah, I mean, I've always kind of attributed more to just more of a John effort. I mean, could Paul have contributed some? Yes. But it would not. I don't see any reason why John could not have written that melody, and that's kind of been my viewpoint on it. I haven't done the research that Susan Ryan did, obviously, on it, but to me, I have no qualms of saying, yeah, that one's John's.
Yeah, they did a scientific testing, a university, and she has all the data on it in that article. Tested the song and conclusively proved that it is a John Lennon song. Of course, we have John's original lyrics, the ones that were very touristy about the Docker's umbrella and the trip from down Smithdown Road into city center and so forth and so on. But
yeah, where I went on my Liverpool vacation type lyrics. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. But the music was also conclusively proven to have been John Lennon. Yeah. And I will tell you, I am so hardcore, let's tell the truth about John, that a lady wrote a review of the third book, She Loves You, and says, I prefer for John Lennon books to be written by someone who loves John, not someone who is against him. What? Yes, that is a review on Amazon. So I will not take up for John.
Jude Albert Goldman Kessler.
I hate the man. I've only given him 40 years of my life. I hate the man, but no, I won't take up for him. If I thought Paul wrote that music, I would stand up for Paul and say it is absolutely his composition.
Yeah.
All right, Donna Patrone, who may not be quite as unbiased because she's the biggest John Lennon fan in America, says, do you happen to know what John's favorite song on Rubber Soul was?
Run for Your Life. I don't know, Jude. Yeah, I don't know, Jude. I mean, to me, it would have to. I would think In My Life would certainly be, John's first maybe true masterpiece. I mean, he wrote a lot of great songs that you love, but when you think about the sophistication, and help me out here, Jude. How old was John when he wrote In My Life?
So if he has it on the 1964 North American tour, he's only 23.
Yeah, so for a 23-year-old. Yeah. To be writing a song like that, where Brian Wilson is writing When I Grow Up to Be a Man, right? John is already this man looking back, and I think and I guess maybe my 10-year-old great nephew is pretty sophisticated for a 10-year-old because that's his favorite song. But to me, it's a beautiful melody, and the brilliance of what John does. He has an idea, and he realizes, this song isn't going to be something people can relate to. But if I just make it about, things and places and keep it general, then anyone hearing that song is going to think of the places that they remember and the people that they loved, as opposed to the places he remembered and loved. And that's what makes it such a great song. The first version of the song, okay, I'm going to learn what these places are in Liverpool and think of them. But what does that do for me? Whereas this song, I think about the places I remember and the people I've loved in my life. And that's why it's such a brilliant transition. Brilliant of John to realize that, I need to move that over.
Yeah. And it's so poignant. And so it's an old soul, as you say. It's an old soul. He is looking back nostalgically the way you do at my age, not at his age. And It just is a very mature song, and I think you're absolutely right. Leslie Healy says, "Look how young they were when I'm 64" was written.
That's right.
Really.
And someone says, Dara says, and I'll follow the sun. Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah. Touching, very touching. Well, I think that we've gotten to the bottom of our Q&A, and we do have a trivia game. Now, I'm going to tell you, people.
I have a good laugh here. Yeah, I always do the air piano in the middle eight with George Martin playing. Actually, that's George Martin playing piano sped up so it sounds like a harpsichord.
Yeah, exactly. Now, on the trivia questions, which I just had, they are all from the PowerPoint. Some of them are easy. Some of them are a little bit difficult. Get it to your keyboards and get ready to write the answer. And the first one is for this very cool Let It Be, see, Big Fair to Paul, t-shirt. It is a size large, I believe. But if you wear a size small, you could always use it for a sleeping shirt. And the question is, this person was mentioned several times during the sneak peek chapter that I read from Shades of Life Part 2. He was the, get ready to type, oh my gosh, Donna Patron, how did you get it? She typed it before I even said it. He was the engineer in October, November 1965 for the Rubber Soul sessions. Who was he? Yes, Norman Smith. Oh my goodness. There you go, Donna.
How did she engineer that answer so quickly?
She told me she was going to really listen. So there you go. All right. Make sure that you send me your address again, because I think I got your address wrong one time when you won a prize. All right. Number 2. This is for this I Love the Beatles badge, which is pretty cool to sew on a jacket. The Beatles producer, George Martin, during the Rubber Soul sessions, was no longer employed by EMI. He had resigned and formed his own independent association. Yes. Scott Ellis. Scott, let's scroll up and make sure. But Scott, I think you were the first person. Leslie Healy. Tell you what, Scott, since I said you were the winner, you and Leslie typed both at 8:43 p.m. I'll give you both a prize. I have coming a Rubber Soul sticker that is the EMI Rubber Soul that you can put on a guitar case or whatever. And Scott, I will send you that sticker. It should be here tomorrow. And Leslie will be sending you that Beatles patch. All right. Number 3.
Wait.
Rand's got to keep everything straight, because after this is over, we spend another hour putting all the packages in envelopes and getting them ready. That's that glittery. Okay, this one you may not be able to see very well. It's a very cool John Lennon. Oh, and we'll do this, and then we'll do that one. It's a very cool John Lennon playing his guitar, large sticker and a small sticker. Okay, so what were when and where were John Lennon's lyrics to This Bird Has Flown photographed, according to Bruce Spizer, in the Beatles' Rubber Soul to Revolver? Oh, Rand, you better scroll down. See who got it. Oh, someone. Let's see, Al. I think. Let's see who was first.
64 tour was Al.
Al.
8:45. Yeah.
Yeah, Al, you got it. And all we have is Al Bro, and I'm guessing there's more to that than Al Bro. So send us on Messenger, or to RJKess, RJKESS at Comcast.net, either place, or Facebook Messenger. Send us your address and we will get the Lennon stickers off to you in the mail. The next one is going to be a free download for the audio book of She Loves You. 33 hours. Scott R. McKinley, narrator and magnificent voice actor. He also did Jay Bergen's book, Lennon the Mobster and the Lawyer, and that's how I heard him. And I was like, oh my gosh, this guy. Okay, Alan Brown. Thank you, Alan. He is so John Lennon. And so I got in touch with him and said, can you do the other Beatles? And he said, absolutely. Can you do Sid Bernstein? Can you do Ed Sullivan? And he did. Scott Ellis. It was a great book. Thank you, Scott. He is phenomenal. So this is a 33 hours with the Beatles. You're going to love it. It's 1963 and the first part of 1964. Bruce, be thinking we got one more trivia question. Be thinking of one you can ask in just a minute.
Okay.
But something you can ask. Okay. So the question is, when did John Lennon first sing "This Bird Has Flown" to George Martin? Yes, January 1965. Bruce, you got it, Bruce. January of 1965. They left, I believe, on the 27th, and they stayed until Sunday, February 7th. They were there for about a week. They went, and John learned how to ski so that when he went back to Austria to record Beatles 2 or Eight Arms to Hold You, eventually Help, he knew how to ski. But that is right. So, Bruce, we will need to get if you'll message us, we will send you the free download for She Loves You. Okay, Bruce, do you have a question we will give away a copy of, I need that book, of Should Have Known Better, which is volume 4 in the John Lennon series.
Boy.
Now, guys, if you already have it, and a lot of you already have it, book is about to sell out. And Bruce and I can tell you that when our books sell out, the secondary market is insane. They go for 200 up. So I've got just a few copies of this left. So hang on to it, put it in some plastic, and when it goes crazy in price, you can sell it. So Bruce,
and for those who don't buy books when they're about to sell out, when they do, and they come up to Jude or I at the fest and like, well, I'd like to get that book. And so it's sold out. And they go, well, I should have known better.
oh, all right, Bruce, what's your question?
This is one not from your PowerPoint, but when Paul was talking to the editor of the Beatles book, and he was describing their situation, he said that something was bare when he was describing their songs they needed to do. So he said something was definitely bare. What was that something?
Ooh, anybody? Paul saying
Melody.
Melody from Donna Patrone.
Nah.
Cupboard from Leslie.
Yes, the cupboard. The cupboard was bare.
Tell him about that, Bruce.
Yeah, I mean, Paul, they get back from this U.S. tour, and Paul's being interviewed, and, well, we talked about it on the plane. We've got EMI wants us to record a single and an album for Christmas, and we really don't have anything. The cupboard's bare, and that's really what Paul was saying. And they literally did not have anything to speak of when they started those sessions.
And why are these questions so hard? I don't know. I don't know. Two things before we tell you where you can get Bruce's book. The one thing is, don't forget the holiday party, which is coming up on 12 December. Joe Johnson will be co-hosting with me. We're going to play all the Beatles Christmas music and some of the fan club records, and we'll be giving away tons of prizes that night. And I'm going to ask some people.
And Leslie Healy will get half of them.
Leslie, you're getting a bad reputation. Ringo Christmas songs, yes, absolutely. So we will play that. We'll have a lot of fun, and we'll talk about the fan club recordings as well. The other thing is that Scott and I will be appearing, me on Zoom, Scott in person, at the Roxbury Library in New Jersey on the Tuesday, the 26th. I believe that's right. Rand, double check me. We will be reading a chapter from She Loves You. 26. And Rand's done a great PowerPoint. And you don't have to live in New Jersey. They're doing it by Zoom for people who want to attend. So we'd love to have you join us that evening. It's free of charge, and a good time is guaranteed for all. Okay, so Bruce, tell us where can people get the Beatles Rubber Soul to Revolver?
Well, the cop-out answer is wherever fine books are sold, but I'd rather say you can get it from my website, Beatle.net, Beatle with no S.net. And what Jude is showing you is the collector's edition, which comes with the case and the groovy posters and the bookmark, as opposed to the standard edition, which is the hardcover edition without the extras. And the hardcover edition of that particular book is $40. And the collector's edition is $100. They're also signed and numbered. Now, the thing to keep in mind if you buy from my website is that I sign all the books shipped from my website. And if you would like them personalized, I'm always happy to do so. And also, we bubble wrap our books and put them in custom sized boxes. In this case, since the book's 9x9, they come in a 10x10 pizza box. Although you don't get a pizza with the book.
Why not?
Why not? Well, although sometimes, well, anyway, I won't get in there about sometimes what sometimes sneaks into boxes, not when we pack stuff. And that was the new book, and the new book. And Jude is technically correct, but see, that's that wonderful poster that shows all of the different variations of the yesterday and today cover in the correct chronological order. So and that's always kind of fun.
Yeah.
But the thing to keep in mind about it is that when you buy directly from an author like Jude or myself or any of us from our websites, we get 100% of that money. And when you buy from someone else, we get a much lower percentage. And so although you may pay slightly more if you're purchasing directly from an author, it really helps us out and enables us to be able to do these books. Because when we do these books, Jude spends a fortune researching her books. I spend a fortune on photo licensing and things like that. And, we don't cut any corners when we do our books like a publisher would make us do at times. Whereas Jude is able to have pretty much a license of, I'm going to make the book I want to make, and I do the same thing. So we always appreciate when you buy directly from us. And of course, if you don't, and you show up at a Beatles convention with your book that you got off Amazon, of course we'll sign them. We'll be happy to do so. But we do appreciate it. The new book, and the reason why Jude is technically correct, is the book, The Beatles Please Me to With the Beatles, is not available yet. If you go on Amazon or try to buy it in a bookstore, they will tell you come back October 17th. Whereas the book is available now through Beatle.net. And therefore, if you want to get the Rubber Soul to Revolver book, of course, it's available there, as is the Please Me to With the Beatles book. If you buy it from the website, you'll have it almost a month ahead of if you were to buy it anywhere else. So we sincerely appreciate you buying our books from whoever you buy them from. If you steal them, not so much. But as long as you're buying them, we do appreciate it, of course.
I did not do a very good job of the Roxbury Library. And it is the Roxbury Library, New Jersey, 26th September at 5:30 Central, 6:30 Eastern. So sorry, I did not get those details straight. Bruce and I want to invite you to join us February 9th through 11th at the New York Fest for Beatles fans. Now, before you say, but wait a minute, that's Super Bowl weekend.
It's Mardi Gras weekend.
It isn't on Friday and it isn't on Saturday. And have you ever thought how much fun we will all have, all of our Beatles family? We can say we are going down to the TV and we are going to watch the Super Bowl together. And we will all be down there shouting and screaming as a bunch of Beatles fans who also love the Super Bowl on Sunday. So don't miss the Fest for Beatles fans at JFK. We're going to be at the TWA Hotel at JFK in February, weather permitting. So hope to see you all. Thank you very, very much for being with us tonight. Bruce's book, so many of the things that I read to you in that chapter came from the Beatles for sale on Parlophone Records and this book. But Bruce has things that other people don't have. And he really understands this music and how it was put together. It is not just a coffee table book. It is full of great, great information. So, Bruce, thank you for this beautiful book, and thank you for being with us this evening.
Glad to do so, Jude, and look forward to seeing you, if not in New Jersey, and certainly in JFK Airport. Perhaps sooner if you make it down to New Orleans.
Okay, that sounds wonderful. Thank you, everybody. Ta-ra and shine on.